All right, hello, my name is Peter Petrakis of Southeastern Louisiana University. Full disclosure, I should admit that I'm a political scientist and not a historian, but since the papers here all deal intricately with politics, I'm looking forward to learning something. So we have three papers to be presented. The first one is entitled Right-Wing Letters to the Shreveport Journal on the Eve of the Presidential Election of 1964. Ralph W. Brown, University of Louisiana at Monroe, will be presenting. So at this time, let's turn our attention to Dr. Brown.
Dr. Brown, you're muted.
Thank you so much. All right, very good. Let's start again. Thank you for having me today. I'm going to get right into it. During the early 1960s, the Shreveport Journal provided a forum for right-wingers from Louisiana and other states. Taking as an example the month prior to the 1964 presidential election, the newspaper printed over 160 letters to the editor, the vast majority from readers who promoted a conservative or even radical right perspective. By comparison, other Louisiana newspapers at the time, such as the Shreveport Journal, published far fewer letters to the editor, if they published any at all. A significant number of the letters to the Shreveport Journal focused on supporting U.S. Senator Barry Goldwater for president. In addition, readers denounced the United Nations, as well as socialism and communism. Some ascribed to sinister conspiracy, the problems facing the United States. Several letter writers defended segregation through their attacks on civil rights. Of course, many letter writers touch upon multiple subjects. When it came to the most common theme, however, most letter writers opposed the election of President Lyndon B. Johnson. You might recall, of course, he inherited the office after the assassination of Kennedy. Though a regional newspaper whose circulation was smaller than its rival, the Shreveport Times, the Shreveport Journal had a readership beyond North Louisiana, extending into Texas as well as to other states. As a California reader noted, your newspaper really gets around. According to that same reader, the Shreveport Journal even made it to distant Ukiah, California. Here, the manager of radio station KUKI had a habit of reading articles from the newspaper over the air. Indeed, he was so enthusiastic about the content of the Shreveport Journal that when he tired of reading, he turned the task over to his news reporter. A woman from Pacific Palisades, California, noted that she enjoyed the newspaper's editorials and letters, finding the letters especially came from well-informed Americans. A San Francisco man noted that the Shreveport Journal was about 4 weeks old when it arrived on his doorstep. But he proclaimed that for a 4-week-old Shreveport Journal was better than no journal at all. During the period prior to the November election, the Shreveport Journal published at least 43 letters supporting Goldwater. To give an example, in early October, a Chicago reader urged members of the public to write their old friends and acquaintances to back Goldwater. He suggested using the following sentences as models to follow. I'm for Goldwater simply because he is honest and even tells the truth when it might seem to hurt him. Washington and Lincoln, our greatest presidents, are perhaps better known for their honesty than any of the other attributes. Going hand in hand with the theme of honesty, some letter writers backed Goldwater in the hopes that upon taking office, he would shed light on perceived government deception. For instance, a Ruston man sent the Shreveport Journal a copy of a letter he had recently mailed to Goldwater. Responding to news of the abrupt dropping of espionage charges against Soviet agent Sokolov and his wife, the letter writer urged Goldwater, upon winning the presidency, to open an investigation of the Defense and State Departments. The Ruston man suspected that the case had been against Sokolov had been abandoned in order to prevent the public from discovering the true connections between the Russian agent and high government officials in the United States. I guess that was an early version of Soviet Russian Russian espionage. Anyway, in addition to printing letters from readers who supported Goldwater, the Shreveport Journal published during the month at least 9 letters to the editor that denounced outright the United Nations. For example, a Texas writer darkly warned that the UN would eventually bring about the amalgamation of all nations into a single Soviet system. In another, a Bel Air, Texas couple sent the Shreveport Journal a copy of their letter to Xerox Corporation regarding the United Nations. In the letter, the couple opposed Xerox's sponsorship of what they called a massive propaganda campaign for the United Nations on American television networks. Though believing that there were many good reasons for their opposition to the United Nations, the couple claimed that the UN's actions in Congo alone, especially the rape of Katanga, should suffice to dampen any enthusiasm for the organization. A Bartlesville, Oklahoma man objected to American funding of United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, believing that it did not truly aid needy children around the world, but in effect supported communist countries behind the Iron Curtain. He warned that UNICEF aid was distributed by communist officials for communist objectives, creating an absurd circumstance, he said, comparable to an imaginary scenario in which the United States sent money during World War II to German children in Nazi Germany. Some letter writers went even further, viewing the United Nations as being at the heart of a communist conspiracy. A Houghton, Louisiana woman claimed that vice presidential candidate Hubert Horatio Humphrey, HHH, had told the public quite brazenly and callously that he and Lyndon Johnson were dedicated to closer and closer ties with red communist countries. They intended to do so as part of a plot to turn over our stockpile of nuclear weapons to the communist-dominated anti-God, one world criminal conspiracy, the United Nations. Johnson was allegedly also part of the problem because of his selection of Humphrey as vice president. A Shreveport woman noted that Humphrey had helped found Americans for Democratic Action, ADA. According to the letter writer, the ADA favored a host of questionable domestic policies as well as the diplomatic recognition of Castro's murderous government and the Moscow puppet regime in East Germany. In addition, the ADA wanted the United States to turn the Panama Canal over to the United Nations and the Guantanamo naval base in Cuba to Fidel Castro. As if that weren't enough, Humphrey had attempted to take away trial rights by jury in a civil rights bill. At least 31 letters to the editor emphasized the dangers of communism and socialism. A Texan from Midland opined that attempts to redistribute the wealth had failed in the past and would fail in the future. Only college professors and politicians who have never worked in the business world, he said, would fall for such a socialist scheme. A Cincinnati, Ohio man went much further, rhetorically asking, who's running our government? And why are no steps taken to halt rampant communism from within and from without? He noted John A. Stormer's "None dare call it treason," pointing out that Americans had been asleep while the socialists had infiltrated the highest levels of our government, education, and even religion. He concluded by warning that unless we awake, our country will fall like an overripe fruit that the communist leader Lenin had predicted. 5 letter writers opposed civil rights and defended segregation outright. And Menon, Arkansas, a man stated that he could not understand how any white man or white woman who had any racial integrity, love for freedom, or self-respect could vote for Johnson or Humphrey. Men who were determined, in his words, to destroy all states' rights, forcibly centralize all power in Washington, D.C., set up a police state and force integration, Mongolarization, degradation, sin, and shame down our throats by Gestapo methods. A Mansfield, Louisiana man alluded to the fact that Goldwater's personal support for integration had been highlighted by some Democrats in a bid to convince segregationists to support Johnson, or at least not vote for Goldwater. He reminded readers, however, that the president had just recently proudly and happily signed into law the most vicious, far-reaching bill on so-called civil rights ever devised. The reader went on to caution that if LBJ and HHH combination was elected, the changes created by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would result, in his words, in an ugly, vicious power grab that would affect every human being in the USA. Other letter writers also objected to Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, though they usually coupled it to additional complaints. For instance, a Louisiana woman rhetorically asked, "Who railroaded the Civil Rights Bill through Congress? And who is disarming our country?" And as well as, "Why are generals fired, generals who are trying to win a war, an undeclared war? And why are our boys called into service when they get captured, abandoned?" Another writer disapprovingly recalled that Johnson, while serving as a majority leader in the US Senate, had supported the Civil Rights Bill of 1960, using round-the-clock sessions to push the bill forward through Congress. At least 66 letters directly opposed Johnson remaining in office, some taking a moralistic tone. For instance, one Shreveport letter writer declared that in the next presidential election, the voter would either cast a ballot for freedom as laid down by George Washington and Barry Goldwater, or cast a ballot for freedom as offered by Stalin, Khrushchev, and Johnson. He went on to write that there was no middle ground in this struggle, in his words, between God and Satan. To give another example, a Shreveport woman noted that Johnson had drained from the heart of our nation the blood of decency and injected his corrupt and illegitimate powers. In addition, Johnson received criticism from voters who normally would have been expected to support the Democratic presidential nominee. For instance, a member of the AFL-CIO urged his union fellows not to vote for Johnson unless they wanted to, in his words, live under socialism. He went on to claim that the president was money and power mad and thought of no one but himself. Adding fuel to the fire, the union man brought up Bobby Baker and Billy Sol Estes, two corrupt individuals tied to Johnson. The union man suggested that the lack of race riots on the eve of the election was the result of Johnson's cynical political maneuverings behind the scenes, keeping racial peace until he secured office. A Mandeville, Louisiana woman also believed that Johnson was part of a conspiracy, though in her case, she connected the president with communism. She noted that the Communist Party USA's leader, Gus Hall, had endorsed the Texan. Consequently, to her mind, a vote for LBJ meant a vote for a socialistic dictatorial government, a partnership with Khrushchev, or a complete surrender to world government. A Shreveport man claimed that Johnson's promotion of social welfare programs and warnings concerning the dangers posed by extremist groups such as the KKK were mere gimmicks. The president's double talk was intended to keep, in his words, the sucker's mind off the real issue. That being a double cross and sellout in Cuba, the Baker, McCluskey, Billy Sol Estes scandals, the foreign aid waste, the present war in Vietnam, and questionable airplane contracts, and a tax cut with an increase in the national debt. He concluded by advocating voting for Goldwater, warning that if the senator was not elected, it could be the last free election in America. An Atlanta letter writer even fancied himself a poet, and the newspaper published his verses. HHH and LBJ all the way for the ADA, Hubert H. and Lyndon B., pawns of the NAACP, Humpty Horatio Dumpty Baines all the way for socialist gains, the banker barons and labor fakers, the Billy Sol Estes and the Bobby Bakers. Oh, what a slaughter they have in mind on polling day of the woolly blind. Okay. Though one might assume that the opinions of ordinary right-wingers published in the Shreveport Journal had little significance to the president, Johnson actually did take notice, as he was very much in tune with what was being published about him in regional newspapers. It's well known that he had an obsession about his media image. Consequently, a few days before the election, Bill Moyers contacted the Shreveport Journal's editor, George Shannon. Moyers, who served as special assistant to the president, complained that the newspaper was promoting Goldwater exclusively while portraying Johnson in a bad light. In response, Shannon conceded that the Shreveport Journal backed Goldwater. They endorsed him for president. He claimed, however, that Johnson had received some positive coverage, listing several articles the newspaper had printed that were favorable to the president, including the newspaper's publication in serial format of Johnson's book, My Hope for America. Shannon also could have pointed out the 4 letters to the editor that he had printed that were favorable to Johnson. In one, a Bossier City woman recalled the days of Republican President Herbert Hoover, predicting that Goldwater would follow in his footsteps, causing another Great Depression should he be elected. She concluded that her letter by crowing, "Republicans, you had better do your laughing now, for you're going to have a long time to cry, for all the gold in water will soon run out." Doubtless worried by the looming prospect of a Johnson victory, Shannon attempted to mollify Moyers. He did so by pointing out that he was an old friend of Moyers' brother Jim. More concretely, Shannon immediately softened his opposition to Johnson, publishing an editorial, "Patriotism in the White House," a copy of which he took care to send to Washington. In contrast, the strident opinions expressed in letters to the editor, the Shreveport Journal now editorially assured the public that both candidates for the presidency had the best interest of the country at heart. The newspaper editorial went on to claim, "We do not believe that the patriotism of either President Johnson or Senator Goldwater could be questioned in the least." Indeed, the Shreveport Journal claimed that notwithstanding the fact the newspaper supported the candidacy of Senator Goldwater, the nation would continue strong and remain the bulwark of world freedom, regardless of who occupied the president's chair after November 3. The Shreveport Journal's editorial failed to win over the president. Soon after the election, Johnson singled the newspaper as hurting him politically. He singled it out. During a telephone conversation with Louisiana's U.S. Senator Russell D. Long, Johnson became extremely agitated, recounting the attacks upon him. According to the president, the Shreveport Journal, and this is quoting him, "produced the literature that was the worst that I ever saw." In the conversation, Johnson noted that Republicans from Longview distributed copies of the paper throughout Texas. When it came to particulars, Johnson claimed that Birchites in the newspaper had called him, in his words, "a dirty, low-down, thieving son of a bitch every day." He also claimed angrily that the Shreveport Journal called him a crook and a rapist, and as well as everything under the sun. Johnson exaggerated somewhat here, as the Shreveport Journal did not publish a Sunday paper. The newspaper also did not publish a letter directly accusing Johnson of rape, though one did come close. A Spring Hill, Louisiana man warned that if Johnson won the election, he would turn loose, in his words, "mad civil rights workers to pilfer, rob, rape, and murder our people while the government gives us little or no police protection." Adding insult to injury, Johnson did poorly at the ballot box in Louisiana, a vote that was in stark contrast to his overwhelming national landslide. Months prior to the election day, Johnson realized that he was in deep trouble in Shreveport. In August 1964, Louisiana's Governor John McKeithen had told Johnson via telephone that the Democrats' nominee was poor, his prospects were poor in the state. McKeithen blamed the press, particularly North Louisiana newspapers that play a tune on the Democratic Party in the state and on Johnson every day, in his words. McKeithen's prediction proved accurate and doubtless informed Johnson's view of the political situation in Louisiana. In the Shreveport in the Shreveport area, after the votes were counted, the president won in Bossier Parish only about 16% of the vote, while in Caddo Parish, he did a little bit better, getting almost a little over 19% of the vote. And of course, he won a national landslide. I think it was the biggest percentage ever, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so quite a contrast. To conclude, on the eve of the November election, the Shreveport Journal promoted right-wing populist ideas in Louisiana and across the country. They were distributed outside of Louisiana. The newspaper did so by publishing numerous letters to the editor written from the perspective of ordinary people who were either conservative or even radical right. Such letters brought up the perceived dangers posed by communism and conspiracy, as well as by civil rights and the United Nations. Most especially, letters to the editor focused on Johnson seeking to keep him from continuing in office as president. Consequently, the Shreveport Journal helped Goldwater secure an overwhelming electoral victory in Shreveport and to win Louisiana. At the same time, by printing letters to the editor from right-wingers, the Shreveport Journal not only caught the president's attention, but provoked his ire. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So now we're turning our attention to Michael S. Martin from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. His paper is titled "Anxiety, Authority, and Acceptance, Louisiana's Congressional Delegation, 1960 to 1972. So at this point, I'll turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Petrakis. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This title no longer works properly after 11 months of going back and forth and changing it. So I scratched out anxiety, authority, and acceptance, but left Louisiana's Congressional Delegation 1960 and 1972 in there. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the Center for Southeast Louisiana Studies and the Young Sanders Center for their support through the J.Y. Sanders Research Scholar Award, which has funded my larger research project, of which this is only a part. I'd also like to take a very brief moment in remembrance of former LHA president and fellow and my colleague Judy Gentry, who passed away this week. So if we can just have a brief moment of silence. Okay. Senator Alan Ellender and Representative Hale Boggs died within 4 months of each other in 1972. With their deaths, the Democratic Party lost two stalwarts in Congress, and Louisiana's Congressional Delegation lost 63 years experience and seniority. Their deaths paralleled others. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal Democratic Coalition had been in death throes for years. The National Democratic majority approached its own demise. The formerly solid and lily-white Southern Democratic Party gasped its last breath. But there were births as well. 1972 brought a new kind of Democrat to Louisiana's governorship, Governor Edwin Edwards, and voters in the state's 3rd district sent a Republican, of all things, to Congress, future Governor Dave Treen. If we return to the senator and the congressman, Ellender and Boggs, we see that they reflected deep differences. Ellender, the elderly conservative, a Huey Long protege and former Speaker of the State House of Representatives. Boggs, the relatively young liberal, a former anti-Longite and a progressive reformer. Those differences extended beyond the two late legislators into the rest of the Louisiana Congressional Delegation. They reflected generational and geographical differences, and they sometimes, but not always, resulted in divergent voting patterns. In this paper, I seek to provide some general thoughts on Louisiana's Congressional Delegation between 1960 and 1972. To do so, I investigate the delegation members' vote on significant legislation that passed during the presidencies of John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. I'll not spend much time laying out biographical information on the delegation members. Instead, I'll just note their congressional tenures and the districts they represented. So, Senator Alan Ellender served in Congress from 1936 to 1972. His junior colleague, Russell Long, held his seat from 1948 to 87, two of the longest tenures in all of Senate history. T. Hale Boggs represented the 2nd District of Louisiana from 1941, with terms off during World War II until 1972. F. Edward Hebert and Otto Passman of the 1st and 5th districts, respectively, began serving in the 1940s and served the entire 12 years that I'll be looking at this, at their voting records. Briefly, the other Louisiana representatives during this time included Overton Brooks, Jimmy Morrison, Edwin Willis, Theo Thompson, Harold McSween, Joe Wagner, Gillis Long, and Speedy Long. So there'll be 3 Longs we're contending with here. Edwin Edwards, John Rarick, Patrick Caffrey, and John Breaux, although Breaux was elected so late that I really won't have anything to say about him. Besides all being from Louisiana, these politicians all shared commonalities. They were all Democrats, they were all white, they were all men. And if we take a look at the districts they served, we can note that aside from Morrison and Gillis Long, who lost re-election bids, and Edwin Willis, Overton Brooks, Theo Thompson, and Harold McSween, who either retired or died in office, they consistently won re-election, which led to a significant amount of seniority in both houses of Congress. That seniority in leadership positions, seniority resulted in leadership positions in the Congress. Notably, Ellender chaired the Senate Committee on Agriculture for 18 years. Russell Long held the chair of the Senate Committee on Finance for 14. He served as Senate Majority Whip from the beginning of 1965 through January of 1969. Boggs was House Majority Whip from 1961 to 1971, and at his death held the Majority Leader position. Had he lived, he likely would have become Speaker of the House. Now, we don't have time today to analyze each of the delegates' votes on every piece of legislation that came in front of them. Instead, I propose that we can get a clear understanding of them by looking at their votes on select key laws passed between 1960 and 72. Due to our time constraints, I've winnowed my analysis down further and focused on the following legislative touchstones. I've grouped them into 4 categories: civil rights, the Great Society, Cold War, and the Nixon era. I don't believe I'll surprise any of you when I say that just about all members of Louisiana's delegation opposed just about all civil rights legislation proposed between 1960 and 72. All members of the delegation, for instance, voted against the Toothless Civil Rights Act of 1960. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which stands as one of the most significant legislative achievements of the last 100 years, saw the final votes for the House version being cast in February of 1964. The Senate version was passed in June of 1964. And then the House review of the Senate version was passed on July 2nd of 1964. Aside from Representative F. Edward Hebert, who didn't cast a vote at all on the final version, the Louisiana delegation all completely opposed it every step of the way. A year later, both of Louisiana's senators opposed all versions of the bill that became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But the tally in the House of Representatives showed a different result. When it came before the House for a final vote, Boggs and Morrison voted for its passage. Otto Passman did not vote, and all other Louisiana representatives voted against it. 3 years later, voting on what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Ellender and Russell Long both voted nay, and Hebert, Wagner, Rarick, Edwards, and Speedy Long, as did all of those and Speedy Long. Passman and Willis did not vote, leaving Boggs to cast the sole yay from Louisiana. Moving on to the Great Society. To start with, although it's not always considered a part of the Great Society program, an $11 billion tax cut bill that had floundered under John Kennedy's presidency became a top priority for Lyndon Johnson in early 1954. The tax cut, Johnson wagered as a good Keynesian, would create prosperity that resulted in higher federal revenue, which could then be used to fund the other elements of the Great Society. When it came time to vote, all of Louisiana's representatives except Passman voted for the bill. In the Senate, Russell Long voted for it, and Allen Ellender against it. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 created the Office of Economic Opportunity, the centerpiece of the Great Society's war on poverty. All of Louisiana's representatives voted for it except for Wagner, who voted against it, and Passman, who did not vote. In the Senate, Ellender voted nay, and Long voted yay. Hebert, Wagner, Passman, Thompson, and Speedy Long voted against the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, but their House counterparts Boggs, Willis, and Morrison voted for it. Ellender and Russell Long both supported it as well. Finally, Wagner, Passman, and Speedy Long opposed the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965, while the other members of the House came down on the positive side. Except for Hebert, who did not vote. The senators split. Ellender voted nay, and Long voted yay. Moving on from 1965, there are a few others there that you can kind of see on this slide. Well, staying in 1965, but kind of moving into a different realm of the Great Society. The 1965 Social Security Amendment that created Medicare. Russell Long actually served as floor leader in the Senate for these amendments. As might be expected, he was the majority whip at the time. And also, as might be expected, he voted yay on the final version, as did Representatives Boggs and Morrison. Senator Ellender and Representatives Hebert, Wagner, Passman, and Speedy Long voted nay, and Edwin Willis did not vote. We shift gears from domestic policy to the Cold War. There are two big stories for the Cold War in the 1960s and the early 1970s. Cuba, and of course, Vietnam. Although the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis garnered attention from members of Louisiana's congressional delegation, such events did not require legislative intervention. Vietnam was a different matter. On August 7, 1964, Louisiana's national legislators voted as a bloc in support of House Joint Resolution 1145, commonly referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President Johnson to take all necessary measures to protect American interests in Southeast Asia and to prevent future aggression there. In 1969, after the rise of an opposition movement to the war in Vietnam, a substantial majority of Louisiana's congressmen still voted in support of the Department of Defense Appropriations Bill, which, among other things, funded the military operations in Vietnam. Edwards and Hebert did not vote. In the Senate, the Cooper Church Amendment was added to that very bill. It prevented spending on the use of U.S. ground troops in Laos or Thailand. Senators Long and Ellender voted against that amendment, and once it was dropped, voted for the overall bill. In 1971, Senators George McGovern and Mark Hatfield proposed an amendment to the Armed Forces Appropriations Bill. This amendment would have completely cut off funds for military operations in Southeast Asia unless all U.S. soldiers were out of Vietnam before December 31st, 1971. The amendment ultimately failed, and Ellender voted against it, while Long did not vote at all on that particular amendment. Turning now to the Republican administration of Richard Nixon. For Nixon, for the Nixon era, I should say, I've chosen the failed Supreme Court nominations of conservative Southerners Clement Haynesworth and G. Harold Carswell to assess Senators Long and Ellender's stances on the Southern strategy of President Nixon. Appointing these kinds of justices to the Supreme Court was a key element of the Southern strategy. And although both Haynesworth and Carswell failed to be confirmed by the Senate, both of Louisiana's senators voted in support of them. Key among Nixon's early actions on the domestic front was a push for Congress to institute massive welfare reform by creating the Family Assistance Program. Debates over the proposal raged from 1970 until 1972. Ultimately, only one representative, Boggs, voted for the reform. Aside from Speedy Long, who was absent for the vote, the rest of the representatives stood in opposition. Long and Ellender both voted to remove the Family Assistance Program from the package of Social Security amendments that it had been attached to, and they then voted to approve the Social Security Amendment without the Family Assistance provision. Two milestone laws passed under the Nixon administration: the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, provide a sense of where the delegates stood on workers' protections and the clarification and expansion of civil rights legislation from the 1960s. Ellender did not vote on OSHA, but Russell Long supported it, as did Hale Boggs. Boggs's fellow House members were either absent, Edwin Edwards and Speedy Long were absent, or they voted against both of those bills. They voted against that bill. On the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which provided authority to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to wage its own enforcement litigation in federal courts, the exact same voting pattern emerged among Louisiana congressmen in the House, but both Long and Ellender voted for the final version of that. Now, with apologies to Professor Petrakis, I know what you're thinking. A whole lot of voting tallies to digest, and we're not political scientists here, right? But there are some preliminary results that I think are evident from a historian's perspective. For instance, at every opportunity they could, just about all of the delegates in Louisiana's delegation voted against any sort of civil rights legislation. The only two to break the pattern were Hale Boggs and Jimmy Morrison. And of those two, Jimmy Morrison ended up being voted out of office in his next election go-around. I suspect that if you know about Louisiana and Southern Democratic politics, you were ready for that close alignment on race and rights. On the other hand, you might find yourself somewhat surprised to know that given their connections to an ongoing and growing national conservative movement, most of the delegation fell into a faction that supported Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program. Russell Long, Hale Boggs, Morrison, Gillis Long, while he was in office, and Theo Thompson until his death, all supported the Great Society. Even Edwin Willis leaned towards the pro-Great Society side. On the other hand, Ellender, Passman, Wagner, and Speedy Long, once he gained office, all fell into the anti-Great Society group, and F. Edward Hebert leaned that way. The only bill that received uniform support, if we exclude non-votes, was the Water Quality Act, and the most opposed was the Immigration and Nationality Act. The Cold War and the Nixon era votes are a bit more difficult to draw conclusions about. Because I only examined selected votes in Congress in this paper, the number of votes on diplomatic matters is limited. once the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was approved, for instance, the president had carte blanche when it came to American involvement in Vietnam. There was really no legislative involvement whatsoever until 1969. And even before that, the major Cold War occurrences of the Kennedy administration had really required no legislation or resolutions for Congress to vote on. So it's not until the late 1960s when bills and amendments emerged constraining the expansion of the Vietnam War that we have an opportunity to further assess the Louisiana delegation's Cold War stances. Simply enough, there were hawks. In fact, the delegation showed a unanimity on the Cold War that superseded its cohesion even on civil rights. Looking towards the Nixon administration again, much of what the Nixon administration is known for or remembered for today either did not fall under the purview of Congress, things like détente and the opening of relations with China, or they fell outside the chronology of this particular paper, the Watergate break-in and its aftermath, for instance. And so without more to go on, it's difficult to make generalizations. I can say that Louisiana senators went along with Nixon's failed Supreme Court nominations and knowingly or not abetted his Southern strategy. The more conservative members of Louisiana's delegation generally opposed welfare reform and the Environmental Protection Act and the Occupational Safety and Health Act, while the more liberals generally did not. To conclude, I realize there's much work left to be done, some of which has already been done. I just didn't have time today to present it. I look forward to sharing it with you in the future, just as I look forward to Dr. Finley's and everyone else's comments this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So our third paper is by Rex Randall Jones, Jr., also of the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And the title, at least the one that I have, is Louisiana and the 1965 Medicare Debate, the Rhetoric of Freedom and the Neoliberal Construction of the Modern American Healthcare System. So at this time, we'll turn our attention to Rex. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Petrakis. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Martin, who served as my thesis chair, without whom this work probably would not have come into creation. This is a portion of my master's thesis, a portion of the third chapter that I'm presenting you today. Quote, whereas the federal government has passed laws bearing directly on the private practice of medicine, be it therefore resolved that the Louisiana State Medical Society collectively determine courses of unified action in advance of the passage of new laws of the Medicare type, that any changes in the laws which contravene our principles will meet with united noncompliance. I've just read a portion of resolution number 110, presented to the Louisiana State Medical Society's House of Delegates in 1966. And this excerpt represents the full-throated opposition of Louisiana's physicians against the Medicare and Medicaid programs. The 1965 Social Security amendments, the legislation which created Medicare, altered the fabric of American healthcare and moved the industry, the physicians, and the patients themselves into a corporate system indirectly attached to the constraints of economics or the mission to heal. National legislation of the Medicare type challenged Louisiana's entrenched racial order and drove home a wedge between the growing liberal wing of the Democratic majority and the Southern conservative segregationist Democrats. The final passage of Medicare and Medicaid brought about desegregation to healthcare more quickly and effectively than any previous ruling or legislation. But it also established framework for an emerging corporatism of modern healthcare and forever altered the public discourse on how best to organize the medical profession in this country. Medicare, the uniquely American form of national health insurance, accelerated the corporate movement in healthcare and simultaneously undermined the public alternative. In Louisiana, the public alternative of the mid-20th century was the state's healthcare infrastructure. Nearly a dozen charity hospitals operated throughout the state, of which the largest and most renowned was New Orleans Charity Hospital. By providing healthcare from a centralized authority, Louisiana provided for most of its poorest citizens in all regions of the state, albeit only according to strict racial hierarchies. Huey P. Long first championed charity system expansion, and in the aftermath of his untimely assassination, his lieutenants realized that ambition in 1937 in Lafayette, Louisiana. It is no coincidence that national and state legislation took different paths on the issue of healthcare in the 1930s. Already reeling from an agricultural bust in the 1920s, the instability of Louisiana's economy brought the Longites to power with the promise of better welfare for all. On the national stage, President Harry Truman tried to introduce a proto-Medicare plan in 1947, but conflict both military and political shortcut that idea, and the moderate but small government Eisenhower administration that followed delayed serious legislative consideration on the issue until a new administration assumed office in 1960. The immediate genesis of Medicare can be traced back to the Care-Mill Acts of 1960. Care-Mill established the Medical Assistance for the Aged program, under which the states determined thresholds of aged patients needed for care and allocated state funds that were then matched by federal dollars. Care-Mills also established a general structure for what would become Medicaid. From Care-Mills eventually came the King-Anderson bill 2 years later by Congressman Cecil King and Senator Clinton Anderson, and they called for expanding the healthcare provisions through Social Security, both to the aged, later to become Medicare, and to the income dependent, later to become Medicaid. Though King-Anderson never passed Congress, by 1964, the Johnson administration preferred the King-Anderson model and threw its full support behind the bill's provisions that now define Medicare. The final Medicare bill had support on both sides of the aisle, as Part B of Medicare, covering physicians and other providers' fees, came from Republican Congressman John Burns of Wisconsin. The federal government, under the direction of the Social Security Administration, would then reimburse participating hospitals and physicians themselves. Medicare ensured that the public model would always follow, rather than compete with, the interest of the private sector. In the passage of Medicare, the long political influence can again be felt on Louisiana and the United States. The ranking Democratic member on the Senate Finance Committee, the committee which could effectively kill the payroll tax provision and therefore derail the entire Medicare bill, was none other than Senator Russell Long, the former governor of Huey P. Long. During the proceedings of the Finance Committee, Senator Long unsuccessfully attempted to substitute the income-related deductible for a flat deductible. But once the bill came out of the Finance Committee, Long again tried a last-ditch attempt to amend the bill by coming at the issue, this time, however, from the left, on the side of expanded government services. He pointed out that the bill did not cover catastrophic illness, and it would not until 1972. He said that that bill should give unrestricted benefits for the poor, rather than simply limiting benefits for the elderly. Essentially, Long's proposal for unrestricted indigent benefits reflected the influence of Louisiana's own extremely popular charity health system, and included that in the substance of the Long proposal. While Long supported the final passage of Medicare in 1965, he had previously opposed similar legislation because he feared that such a system would inevitably turn to a universal program of socialized medicine. Long's ambition, however, proved useful to the Johnson administration, which then selected him for congressional leadership. Long's working relationship with the president and his own political aspirations eventually led him to floor leadership for the Medicare bill while it was in the Senate. Long's conflicting positions might seem to be an ideological contradiction. In Louisiana, however, Long's two positions had long existed side by side in a statewide hospital system, at least since the Depression. But Southern politicians' fear of government control in medicine is but one manifestation of an even deeper fear of government intervention on race. Long's attitude on government intervention speaks to a broader history of the issue of medical care in Louisiana. And he, Long that is, was not the only one to fear the centralization of American medical institutions. The fear of that centralization and state control at the height of this Cold War rendered any discussion of even the smallest movement towards a semblance of a state system politically challenging. Mutually exclusive narratives about healthcare remain a dichotomy between socialism as opposed to freedom. That powerful two-choice narrative permeates American history, and the mid-20th century saw many movements in support of and in opposition to government intervention on a host of issues. But in healthcare, the two-choice narrative is a false one. Many in the United States feared the specter of socialism in 1965, And in the lead up to Medicare's congressional vote, the American Medical Association and the American Hospital Association channeled immense resources into opposing the bill by playing upon those fears. Both associations favored a proposal called elder care, a voluntary government assistance program more akin to supplementary medical insurance. And they brought massive resources to bear in Louisiana through the New Orleans Parish Medical Society, an appendage of the American Medical Association. In a letter dated February 25th, 1965, A.M. Edwards, a field representative for the AMA, the Medical Association, promised immediate material assistance to Mr. A.J. Kuhlman, Secretary of the Orleans Medical Society. Edwards wrote, quote, "In compliance with your request, I am sending you 25,000 copies of Why Elder Care Offers Better Care Than Medicare. However, we can only send you 10,000 at this time, which I hope will suffice until a later date." Members of the Orleans Parish Medical Society appeared frequently in the local papers, addressing any audience they could hope to address in order to quash the bill. The March 17, 1965 edition of the New Orleans State's Item headlined, "New Orleans Physician Wraps Medicare Bill." The very next day, the Times-Picayune ran, "Physician Hits Medicare." A Dr. William W. Wolfe, member of the Orleans Society, said, quote, "The more I study the benefits and limitation of the Medicare proposal, the more convinced I am that this bill was not conceived for humanitarian reasons." To the members of these organizations, Medicare represented the most flagrant attempts to reduce their own professional sovereignty and deny the freedom of choice to all patients. The Society's efforts expanded to cooperation with other bastions of anti-Medicare resistance. In the May 11th, 1965 meeting of the Orleans Parish Medical Society Board of Directors, the all-white male assembly discussed a telephone call received from the Los Angeles County Medical Association. The Los Angeles Association reached out to New Orleans and to other metropolitan chapters across the country for a last-ditch effort to defeat the Medicare bill. Though the Orleans Society did not attend those meetings, they did adopt the resolutions which emanated. The resolutions which emanated clearly indicated the position of these chapters across the country. And they opposed the Medicare bill because they believed in, quote, "free choice for the patients and the physicians, and freedom from the restrictions regarding the practice of medicine and the maintenance of the highest quality of medical care," which they thought would be imperiled should this new legislation be passed. In spite of the Medical Association's resistance and attempts by some Southern Democrats, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the bipartisan pro-Medicare bloc ensured passage of the bill. The final vote cleared 307 to 116 in the House and 70 to 24 in the Senate. A total of 55 Democrats broke with their own party on the issue of Medicare, including 4 House members and Senator Alan Ellender from Louisiana. In the end, the pragmatist Russell Long came down in favor of the final proposal, which he had led the fight for. In spite of particularly fierce resistance, the popularity of the program won out in Congress over vociferous dissent of the medical profession because of the broad provisions of care and covered hospitalization costs, which appealed to so many. Nearly a year after the passage of Medicare, the Louisiana Medical Association gathered in Alexandria on May 4th, 1966. I began this paper with a discussion of that, or a quote from that assembly. And there they discussed the organization's ongoing resistance to Medicare and attempts to unify their resistance despite fraying professional opinion. Dr. John J. Burden, the newly inaugurated president of the Lafayette General Hospital Board of Trustees, seems to have attended that meeting as the complete agenda, legislative guide, and roster survived in his papers. The Louisiana Medical Association president, Charles B. Odom, gave a sobering statement faced by his professional medicine. Odom himself had gone to Washington personally and met with members of the Louisiana Congressional Delegation. Felix Hebert, who voted nay, is mentioned specifically in Odom's report as having several meetings with the Medical Association representatives. He also met with members of the Federal Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and Odom did his best to bring the full strength of the Louisiana Medical Association to bear. However, in his report in 1966, in the aftermath of the association's defeat on the Medicare bill, he addresses the full delegation, the full membership in the following. Our most serious challenges at the present time originate with some within our own ranks, from individuals who would risk destroying our organization in order to force their views upon all members of the profession. The vast majority of us are moderates who realize that changes are taking place all around us, and they are trying to adjust to these changes. Many of us within the profession fought the Medicare Act to the very last ditch, but in spite of our fight, it was enacted into law. We remain opposed to this program of government medicine. We have tried to obtain regulations to implement this law, which will make it possible for us to live with it and continue to discharge our responsibility to our patients with the least interference. Many, especially on the left, had hoped that the passage of Medicare and Medicaid would usher in responsible government intervention and the realization perhaps of a universal health insurance program. The final bill, however, turned out to be the single most complicating and decentralizing facet of the American healthcare system. According to the provisions of Medicare as they existed in the late 60s, the reimbursements given to the hospitals were cost-based, determined by the value the hospital and the physicians themselves set on the procedure. This compromise, in theory, allowed the private professionals to maintain control of the system. In practice, however, the price of the services rendered could be adjusted by the hospital or the individual doctor to take advantage of a cost-determined system with unlimited reimbursement potential. Beginning just a few years later, documented as early as the late 1960s, the cost of American healthcare skyrocketed, encouraging both the consolidation of healthcare industries and the creation of what we might call the most recent or modern insurance complex. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this time, we'll turn our attention to Dr. Keith Finley, my colleague at Southeastern Louisiana University. And so Keith, look forward to your comments.
All right. Hello, everyone. Greetings. I want to thank our speakers for their engaging presentations, as well as our audience who joined us on this rain-soaked afternoon, at least here in Southeast Louisiana. The changes necessitated by COVID have forced us into a virtual world. This is something that modern-day Luddites like myself deeply lament. Indeed, I required the assistance of at least 3 individuals today to be available for you during the Zoom presentation. Like many of you, I am anxiously awaiting the time when we can do this in person. I have only received papers from Dr. Michael Martin and Rex Randall Jones, so I'm unprepared to comment on the third presenter, Ralph Brown. The 1960s and 1970s represented a period of profound change to the nation in general and the American South in particular. Not only did the period witness an assault on the Jim Crow system of segregation, it also brought an unprecedented centralization of government authority that dramatically hastened a process which commenced with the Great Depression. President Lyndon Johnson's efforts to build the Great Society, which was rooted in the twin desires to end racial injustice as well as poverty in America, dominated public discourse in the 1960s as this most peculiar and determined of American presidents pushed the nation to live up to its highest ideals. As in any period of profound change, the American population polarized in the 1960s as citizens attempted to make sense of the new order being wrought all around them. Certainly, LBJ's efforts troubled conservatives in the Republican Party, as well as conservatives in his own Democratic Party. Southern politicians were often forced to straddle an ideological divide. Many of them came from fiercely conservative districts, which expected them to toe the lines on matters of race. At the same time, these politicians often represented some of the nation's poorest districts. Thus, they possessed a constituency that would greatly benefit from the programs that comprised Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. The papers today harken back to this period of profound change, to a time when Louisiana citizens were attempting to make sense of the seemingly inexorable swirl of events taking place around them. In many ways, this period of history was not unlike the one we live in today. In the present, we face a similar swirl of uncertainty as the nation experiences social, cultural, and political shifts that render many feeling beleaguered and sometimes helpless. Adding to our current consternation is the fact that we are forced into isolation by a virus, which makes the radical change of our time appear even more ominous to some. Our presentations today, I would like to think, offer a ray of hope in our uncertain times. Even the characters in Dr. Brown's presentation, no doubt, came to realize over time that America was still a pretty great place to live, despite the fact that Barry Goldwater did not win the 1964 presidential election. Rex Jones's essay, Louisiana and the 1965 Medicare Debate, offers a glimpse into the controversy surrounding just one aspect of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, the Medicare and Medicaid programs. As in any period of change, the defenders of the status quo made themselves heard. Louisiana physicians and others in the state's medical community viewed Medicare with trepidation. They lavished vast resources on an effort to inform and influence the state's citizens to oppose the proposal, which they argue would limit the ability of doctors to do their jobs and deny patients their freedom to choose healthcare providers and services that they wanted. Socialized medicine, as they labeled it, ran counter to the long-standing tradition of local option revered in the state and struck many as being un-American, coming as it did in the middle of the Cold War. Most interesting is how quickly the state accommodated itself to the changes that Medicare brought. Indeed, despite dire forecasts from groups like the New Orleans Medical Society, state healthcare providers almost immediately recognized that Medicare was far less intrusive than feared and offered something that many of them really liked: money. Indeed, one statistic in particular stands out in Jones's work. In the first year of Medicare's implementation, Lafayette General Hospital increased outpatient service receipts by 43%. Once the potential for lavish profits became clear, the medical community, even in deep southern states such as Louisiana, grew conveniently comfortable with at least this form of socialized medicine. Rex Jones's work is clearly part of a larger piece. As we heard, he mentioned this was part of his master's thesis. It has been reduced to fit the parameters of a conference paper, and thus this particular snippet that I read often lacks contextual information and comes across as disjointed in places. The author goes from point A to point D without guiding the reader to point B and point C. Naturally, this is to be expected considering the circumstances, and I am sure these concerns are adequately fleshed out in the larger work out of which this comes. And in fact, I'm pretty sure Dr. Martin would also not permit his graduate students to not cover all their bases. Dr. Michael Martin's work focuses on Louisiana's Congressional Delegation during this period of flux. He introduces us to a delegation, at least in this period, that was solidly Democratic and which rarely experienced electoral defeat. Once elected, Louisiana senators and representatives tended to stay in office a long time, gathering lots of seniority and acquiring important committee chairmanships along the way. Dr. Martin's essay reveals a critical fact about Southern politics. Despite a still prevalent belief that Southerners are of one mind politically, Martin reminds us that outside of the arenas of civil rights and Cold War policy, Louisiana's congressional delegation was evenly divided on much of the Great Society agenda, including programs such as Medicare. In his study of select roll call votes, Dr. Martin reveals the lack of uniformity in the state's delegation. The state's politicians, like the constituents that they represented, were clearly attempting to find their way through a tumultuous time. That they were so evenly divided on the major issues of the day points to the existence of a far more diverse electorate in the state than many historians and political scientists have heretofore been willing to concede. Martin's paper, like Jones's before it, is difficult to assess because in this case, it represents an opening salvo in a much larger and ambitious project. Dr. Martin provides us with flashes of the compelling narrative that will no doubt emerge from this project, but in its current form, it is still very much a work in progress. Once COVID-inspired travel and research restrictions are lifted, the author will need to burrow into the archival collections associated with these Louisiana politicians. A lot of things go into the votes that appear in the congressional record. Only the personal papers of these politicians, and perhaps some interviews, can provide you with the critical information that really explains why these individuals voted the way they did. Likewise, attention needs to be given to the rationale surrounding the specific roll call votes privileged in this essay. An explanation of the methodology employed to winnow the field of votes to the ones selected in this paper is certainly needed. The concerns raised here will no doubt, just as we heard earlier, be settled as the manuscript passes from its current tentative state and starts to assume a more concrete form over time. In the end, these papers reveal the efforts of Louisianans as they struggled with an ever-changing and fast-changing world. At the time, many pointed with dread to the potentially destructive nature of changes that were coming the state's way. In each of the cases we have seen today, these initial fears abated as prophesied destructive forces never came to pass. Louisianans today who live in fear of the unknown should look to the lessons from history, not to reaffirm their pre-existing fear of change, but to understand that Louisianans have gone through similar crises in the past, and in the end, things turned out okay in the long term. Anyhow, those are my remarks, and I pass it now to Pete and open up the floor to questions.
Okay, as I said, I'm new to Zoom, but I believe this is a question that was sent to me privately by Fernan Eaton. And it has two questions for each of the excellent presentations. So the questions are, what was their muse or triggering inspiration that brought these questions before them? And where are they taking their research? I suggest we answer them in the order in which the papers were presented.
Okay, well, I'll go first. You might want, Dr. Finley might want to check his email. If he looks at, I think, February of 2020, I sent the paper his way, so perhaps it got lost in the COVID business, but you did receive a copy of my paper. As far as my muse, this is partly of necessity, having lived in Louisiana for more than a decade. In terms of getting at sources that are interesting, I think that's part of why I'm getting into this. I ran across a passage in Michael Beschloss's edited account of LBJ's telephone conversations, in which he discussed the Shreveport post office with Russell Long. And I wondered why in the world he was so angry at Shreveport. And that's sort of what started me down this road. And the more I get into it, it's incredibly Byzantine, trying to untangle it all. But that's what originally got me going down this road. And then there's just so much there. To give a real quick example that wasn't in my paper, the Democratic Party in 1964 ran in the Shreveport Journal and other papers, including the Advocate, ads against Barry Goldwater in which they accused Goldwater of being an integrationist, not a segregationist, but an integrationist. So it's a very curious, Louisiana politics is very curious. And that's what got me into all of this. And I hope at some point to either have this as an article or a book. So that's where I'm going with it. And anyway, hope that helped.
Okay, thanks. And so everybody knows, but Michael, Dr. Martin, it's your turn, please.
All right, thank you. Muse, everywhere I look in Louisiana, there's a muse to discuss Louisiana politics. Having grown up here, crossing over bridges that were named after various Longs, seeing buildings named after them, that sort of thing. I grew up with a fascination about the Long family. Ultimately, that culminated in a doctoral dissertation and a biography of Russell Long. And while I was writing that, it occurred to me just how prominent and important Louisiana's congressional delegation as a whole was in the 1960s. When you start thinking about the seniorities that they had, when you start thinking about the chairmanships that they held, and not only that, but where, what committees they were ranking members on, and the kind of sway that they had over political blocks. It was evident to me that something needed to be said about this. Now, I didn't know what to expect to find, and I'm still working my way through this. Initially, I had hoped to get a master's student or a PhD, or someone who was going off to a PhD program to take this subject on, but that never happened. So I decided to go ahead and do it myself. Dr. Finley, you're absolutely right. I'll never fully get this until COVID's over and I can really get into those archives. Looking at the congressional record, looking at the kind of public stances through newspapers and all that is just not the same as getting to that. I don't know if this is a muse, but I've found doing this work, again, reminiscent to what Dr. Finley said, it's very therapeutic in the sense that I realized, wow, there was a time when politics seemed to work, when even if you were conservative, you could work with liberals, and even if you were liberal, you could work with conservatives, and you could be in the same party. And these are things I already knew, but it's awfully nice to be reminded of that over the last year or more. Where am I taking the research? Well, clearly I'm going to start, once I can, getting into places like LSU's archives, Tulane's archives. I know LSU's, I think, has just recently opened back up. I'll certainly be spending time in Hammond at the Center for Southeast Studies, looking at Jimmy Morrison's papers. And as I've just kind of gone through these public stances of these legislators, what I found is there are three that really stand apart from the others, and that's Russell Long, Hale Boggs, and Jimmy Morrison. And so I'm thinking about kind of honing in on them as kind of the next stage of what I do, because they're all willing to take risks politically at varying times and on varying legislation. Two of them do that without really much in the way of repercussions, and it's pretty evident why. I mean, Russell Long, one, he's a senator, so he has more leeway in terms of what he does and voter memory about it. But two, he's a Long, right? And he's not going to get beat by anyone who goes up against him. I really believe he could have voted for the Voting Rights Act, and I think he wanted to vote for the Voting Rights Act, but ultimately he came down on the side that most Southern politicians did at that time. And that's based on other research that I've done for the biography. Morrison, though, is in this kind of place where voting for the Voting Rights Act was clearly used against him. And this is something that Dr. Finley brought out in his recent Louisiana History article. I mean, that was maybe the final straw. There were other elements to it, but to have just a couple of years later, someone like John Rarick running, saying to the voting population of, basically the Florida parishes, this guy voted for the Voting Rights Act. There was enough backlash against that. And we see that elsewhere. We see it in Tennessee with people like Albert Gore Sr. and folks like that. Hale Boggs was in a unique situation because he's from New Orleans, right? And so he can be a little bit out there when it comes to his politicking because, well, one, it's New Orleans, but two, his supporters, his voting bloc is different, much more diverse. There are many, many more registered Black voters in New Orleans. So he doesn't have to really weigh those risks the way that other politicians in the state do. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Felix Hebert or Otto Passman were worried about what their voters were going to do when they voted against the Civil Rights Act. They voted their conscience on that, I think. But they had to take it a little bit more seriously than certainly Russell Long, and the consequences a little bit more seriously than Russell Long and Hale Boggs. So that's where I see myself going in the immediate future over the next few months or so.
Again, thank you very much, Michael. And Rex, if you would like to answer the two questions, I look forward to hearing it.
Thank you. When I started my master's 3 years ago, and I finished it since submitting this paper, very glad that happened. But originally I thought I wanted to study modern Europe and political alignments in modern Europe. And then I took a Louisiana historiography class with Dr. Martin, and I had to write a paper. And it was really obvious how many resources there were available in Louisiana. And I was very interested in kind of an economic angle, the mechanics behind healthcare. And so that became a thesis project and eventually went on to be 4 chapters. And so that availability of resources plus the local connection that I have to Lafayette. I've lived here for about half my life. And so those kinds of, and I pass the hospital now. I can see the hospital when I walk out my front door now. So I was always kind of interested in it. And where I plan to go from here is I am very fortunate to be a civics teacher in high school. And so I'm looking forward to May the 28th, not just because that's the students' last day, but then I plan to have the summer to work on this project. I would like to turn it into a manuscript at some point or within the next year, 2 or 3. So I'm interested in that kind of project.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody's participation. I thought it went very well. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free, but otherwise, we may be able to bring this to a close. So I believe everyone can see the message from James Wilson, thanking everyone and noting the schedule for spring 2021 and the website.